from Islamic Relief Worldwide, coming to us from Pakistan, who is the head of strategic partnerships and business development. We then have Alicia Wallace who is the director of Equality Bahamas. So we will have also some Caribbean perspectives today, looking at migration issues, loss and damage, intersectionality in the Caribbean. And lastly, we are very happy to be joined by Labatanalagi Seru from the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, who is a climate justice project officer there. So I think we've done a great job covering at least a good spread of the regions of the world, and hopefully seeing not just intersectionality as a comma phenomenon, right? Gender, comma, LGBTQI, comma, migrants, comma, poverty, comma, but really let's talk about how power and marginalization meet at a crossroads, and how that power and marginality manifest when it comes to human mobility, and looking at that specifically from a context perspective, and connecting it, of course, to the policy messages that we want to give out to both the policymakers here, but also those attending virtually and organizations. So without further ado, I'm going to begin by asking my colleague, Tatiana. So as an academic, if you could tell us, how do you see the intersection, both of these issues, in human mobility, climate change, and loss and damage? How do you see that as an academic? Where do you see the gaps are? Where can we go forward?
Thank you. Well, I think, first of all, I'm so happy to be here with you and to have an event live after the pandemic. I think what we have seen in recent years, both in research and policy, is that they're all about gender mainstreaming. But I think the time has come for us to move forward, and to move forward to what? To diversity and intersectionality mainstreaming. But what is, it's even difficult. What does that even mean? How can we even do that? So today I come with 3 suggestions, both for research and for policymakers to move forward. And I think the first one is that we should move beyond seeing gender as binary. We should move beyond seeing gender as just women who are vulnerable, because that's mostly what we see, for example, in disaster research. A lot of focus is on how women are vulnerable and their capabilities. And we understand that that's something that we have seen in disaster settings. We know, for example, that before a disaster, they're more likely to not evacuate because they have to be taking care of elderly, of children. So we know that, and we know that when it comes to migration decision-making, gender matters, but that's not only the identity that matters. Sexual orientation matters, sexual identity matters, and especially after natural disaster, we've seen that policies and programs don't take into account the needs of, for instance, LGBTQ individuals. We've seen that after Hurricane Katrina, after this Indian Ocean tsunami, and I think moving beyond seeing gender as binary can also allow us to move beyond the definition of families. And that would allow us to include more people into the governance assistance after disasters. So I think that's one way we can move forward. And the second one is, although, of course, gender and sexual identity and sexual orientation matter, other social identity matter when it comes to migration in the context of climate change. For instance, caste matters, ethnicity matters, social class matter. And I can think of an example of Colombia a few years ago. During the El Niño droughts in Bolivar, in the department of Bolivar, a lot of families thought they could adapt to this drought by moving temporarily to cities nearby to find work. But the families that moved, most of them either knew people in the cities or had some additional income from besides farming, or had some savings. So they went there, they managed to adapt to these routes, and then they came back to their communities. But others, they were not able because they didn't know people in the cities, because they didn't have savings. So they tried to adapt For instance, by selling livestock or by consuming less food. But eventually, the drought was much longer than anybody could have anticipated. The drought was more intense, so in the end, they actually had to move away permanently from their communities. They have to leave behind families, they have to leave behind the way of living, their traditions, so they lost that because the policies in place and the programs in place didn't allow them to use migration as a viable adaptation option. So that would be the second key message, is that understanding that class matters, ethnicity matters, land ownership matter when it comes to making these decisions. Not only gender, although gender and social identity and sexual orientation are important, it's also about including other social identities in the discussion. And the third message would be like, okay, yes, these social identities matter, but as Caroline said, we're just not like, they're not commas. It's not, yes, you're a woman, comma, you're an indigenous woman, comma, no. It's how they all intersect. I am Colombian, I am a woman, I'm a migrant, but that doesn't mean that I just check these boxes and that's it. The way I see myself as a woman has been shaped by my migration experiences and has been shaped by being Colombian and being away, and has been shaped by all of that. And it's also, it's not, I don't feel, the identities are not static. They change in time, they change in context, they change in places. So I think it's also important to move beyond just these additions of demographic characteristics, but understanding how they interlock and how they represent systems of oppression and of privilege, and that they're always shaping each other, which is why context is so important and it matters when it comes both in research and for policy making. So I think, yeah, that was it.
Thank you so much. I'm glad on that last point that you mentioned this, especially as academics and researchers, the ways we talk about these categories, especially quantitatively, and I know you are a mixed methods specialist and you also have a quantitative background, but that we're often talking about disaggregating data. So disaggregating it for sex, for gender, for, and seeing these as demographic categories, but maybe sometimes we need to be aggregating these things qualitatively and seeing how they add up, not just trying to take them apart. So thank you very much. So next I want to move to our next speaker. So Sarmad Iqbal, could you tell us, how does loss and damage interact with climate change, human mobility, migration, or displacement in the Pakistan context?
Thank you very much. Let's take this debate of climate migration to another level. Migration in general has been categorized as seasonal migration across the globe. And we've been foreseeing it as people moving within different seasons to do different harvesting or different rearing of animals and a lot of other stuff. But currently, those people have moved from their areas because the resources are not left there. They're moving into a new area. They're not used to the dynamics. They're not used to the culture there. They're leaving behind everything that they have. They own their language, their culture, their indigenous knowledge. Everything is left behind. Now, they're moving into a new area. The new area has a different culture, a different caste system, a different village, people belonging to certain different ethnic origins, or it's an urban setting which is converted into an urban slum. Rather, it was not a fully urban setting, it was an urban slum. These people have moved there. All that culminates into a lot of different dimensions. One, the impact on children. How and what kind of impacts would the children have being brought up in a new environment where there's disconnect between their own indigenous language, culture, as well as being brought up into a new culture. They're mixing everything up. The second, they've lost everything. They've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their ways of income that they were pursuing, and they're now living as a migrant and adding to the street children concept within those areas. They're exposed to trafficking, they're exposed to exploitation. The girls, especially, they're exposed to huge protection issues. Unfortunately, we couldn't get our video on time, which could have been played here, and that would have shown you the exact turmoil that these families face when they migrate from one area to the other. Now, for migration in Pakistan, we've seen two types of migration. One, because of the emergencies or disasters happening. But the second and the most important and the most feared one is the slow onset. Changing weather patterns, livelihoods being destroyed, crops being destroyed, no water being available, and then those families, those villages of hundreds and hundreds of households moving to another location in search of resources and in the hope that they would find water there and they'll start to rebuild. And when they end up in that new location, they come to know that the people or the villagers that were living here have moved out of those areas because the resources have shrunken or resources are no more there. So they have to double migrate. Now that adds to a lot of miseries of those families. And culminating it or taking it forward within the government circles, there's no policy that I've seen so far addressing the climate migration, neither in the urban settings, neither in the rural settings. Pakistan's national climate change policy talks about climate migration as one component, just a small two-word line which says climate migration needs to be addressed. But how? By promoting green villages in the outskirts of urban centers. But are we really doing that? And that is the same thing that has been reflected in UNFCCC's migration policy as well, or the guidelines as well. But there's no clear roadmap. And we actually need to start raising the voice of the people who have been impacted because of these migrations to take this debate at another level. I'm not an academician, I'm not a technical person. I speak on behalf of people. I speak on the miseries that these people are faced with. I speak on the challenges that these girls, women, young boys face. And then most of all, the elderly, the people with disability or different ability, old age, that adds on. It's hugely impacting these people. And when it comes to the South Asian region, we are seeing a lot of displacement happen. And it's not being monitored, neither checked. No data is available in terms of how things are moving forward and how they need to be. And building on that, all this debate around the nexus of climate impacts and migration and loss and damage is intricately connected to where these people were and where these people are now. And that anthropological research or that human element of that impact needs to be brought out from across the globe, because we are unable to address this unless and until we understand the issue of migration in its holistic perspective. We've got good academicians talking about it, but currently statistics don't add up to the human misery that's on the ground. And just to build on that, we'll be launching our climate-induced migration report that we did for Pakistan on the 11th or 10th? It's on the 10th, okay. It's on the 10th in the Pakistan pavilion, the government pavilion in the Blue Zone. So we'd like to have you guys present there, because there we'll be talking in specifics about what is going on. Now, based on those that research, the key findings that came out, one was we need to actually look at laws and policies from national as well as international perspective and come out with certain clear roadmaps or directions for the national governments. The second was we need to actually invest, but invest in an intelligent manner with regards to how we can control or curb or reduce down the impacts of this migration on people by having social safety programs or food security programs or livelihood uplift programs or social protection programs. It can vary region to region. And the third thing was that when they move, there's a huge impact on children by not being educated. They're losing out on education. They're ending up in exploitation and trafficking. And so far, I have not seen any study or any finding or any way forward coming out on what to do with these displaced people who are actually selling their children or who are actually pushing their children, especially young girls and boys, in the name of economic migration to land up in trafficking in different regions across the world. So that's another angle that we need to look at with regards to this. And this is a huge subject. You can't cover it in just 5-7 minutes, but there's a huge debate that needs to happen on this. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's good that we can't cover it in 5 to 7 minutes. I wouldn't have a job. So, no, you did cover an incredible amount. I'm quite impressed by that. But I think one of the things that sticks out to me too about your intervention is, one is that we're talking about intersectionality, not just at an individual level, right? But also how that affects the collective, how families, and not as academics, we often say households, which I always feel is a little bit sad, neutral, right? As if they're not people, it's just a household. But yeah, but how families are affected and how not just what happens in terms of intersectionality driving migration, but what happens after, right? What happens to inequalities? How are those entrenched when there's no protection mechanisms, for example? And again, moving to action, right? Let's not just talk about intersectionality, that it matters, but what needs to be done about it? What can be done by the people in this room, for example? So thank you so much. Moving to the Bahamas and a little bit more to the international side of migration in a regional perspective. Alicia, what can you tell us about loss and damage in the Caribbean?
Well, first I want to contextualize what we're talking about, because intersectionality is at the center of this conversation, and it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? So I want to make sure that we're grounded in that and make sure that we give respect to the Black scholar that coined the term in 1989. So that was Kimberly Crenshaw. And she was looking specifically at the intersection of Blackness and womanhood. So being both woman and Black at the same time, and recognizing that Black women are not only experiencing racism and anti-Blackness, and they're not only experiencing sexism and misogyny, but both at the same time. And we also have another Black scholar, Moya Bailey, who coined the term misogynoir, which is specific to hatred of Black women. So when we talk about intersectionality, let's understand that it's rooted in Black scholarship and about Black women. And now we're using it to look at other identities, intersections of race, class, gender, migration, citizenship, disabilities, all of these different aspects of our identities. And this is important to take into context when we're looking at climate change, because we tend to talk about climate change as if it's a separate issue, or it's something that's affecting people all in the same way once they're in the same geographic space. But in the Bahamas, we saw that that is absolutely not the case. We are quite accustomed to hurricanes. They are kind of a normal thing for us. I grew up with hurricanes and getting ready for them and knowing, yes, we need to go to the store, we need to get batteries, get extra water, but at the end of the day, it's just gonna be fun, the electricity will go off and whatever. And that's kind of the attitude that you have growing up, but 2019 changed everything when Hurricane Dorian, a superstorm, Category 5, just sat over our islands for an extended period of time, devastating Abaco and its keys, as well as Grand Bahama. So we saw damages that were estimated by the Inter-American Development Bank to be around $3.4 billion. This is in a country of less than 400,000 people. We're an archipelago. It's quite difficult to get supplies to different places. Rescue efforts were quite difficult because we're a small island developing state. We're a big ocean state. One of the things that Equality Bahamas has been doing, because our focus is on women and LGBTQI people, so we're promoting women's rights and LGBTQI people's rights, but when storms hit, we know that women are disproportionately affected. So we always do a drive, specifically to collect menstrual hygiene products in particular, because it's something that just people don't think of. People also don't often think about baby items. So we run a drive every time, and with Hurricane Dorian, because of the extent of the damage, we said, okay, we have to go a little bit bigger. And we connected with another organization, Lend a Hand Bahamas, to scale up our operations. We operated out of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, which is pretty unprecedented, to be in a gallery space where people are looking at art and also be there with boxes and boxes and boxes of supplies. So we can't thank them enough for allowing us to have that space and for people to be able to come in all day long bringing supplies. And initially, it was supposed to be a donation center, but it quickly became a distribution center. that was not the plan. But people knew that we had supplies, they started coming for them, and what we were supposed to do is say, no, we're sending it over to some other place so you can join these long lines. And we saw that many, many, many women were coming in, not just for supplies for themselves, but for their families. They're coming in with the sizes that their children, their husbands, their uncles, their brothers-in-law, that everyone wears. We had a few men come in, and typically they couldn't really answer questions like, okay, do you need menstrual hygiene products for your wife? Yes. Does she use tampons or pads? I don't know. But women tend to have all the information. They hold all the information for everyone within their households and within their communities. We also saw quite a lot of Haitian migrants. So the Bahamas has a lot of migration happening from Haiti to our islands. And many of those people were either undocumented or completely lost all of their documents. And it was quite difficult for them to be able to access supplies, because many distribution centers started asking for ID. They started connecting with each other. They wanted to track who was getting what. They wanted to make sure that no one was taking advantage of the system. And it was quite interesting to see different people, international aid organizations coming to us, the media coming to us saying, how do you know that these people are really affected by the storm? How do you know who's who? How do you know that people aren't collecting things to open a store? And I was just thinking, this is ridiculous. You know, if people have experienced this storm, and they figured out a way to turn these boxes that we're giving out of, 4 tins of tuna and 2 tins of corned beef into a store, power to them. Please keep coming and collecting these boxes. There are people who were in need before the storm, and if they're coming on this line to collect food, have at it. So we really need to move outside of this idea of policing who's able to access and who's able to get what they need, because everyone has specific needs. LGBTQI plus people were pretty invisible throughout this process. There was no conversation about them. You can only kind of pick up on it if people are flagging. So if you can kind of tell by the way that they dress or carry themselves, or if they come in with their partners. And I was talking to someone the other day about the topic of this panel. And he said, well, I don't really see how all of that fits together, because yeah, some people are disproportionately affected by climate change, but that's based on geography, not sexual orientation. And I said, okay, let's just take a minute and step back here. Let's talk about what happens to LGBTQI plus people. Being kicked out of their homes at a young age, being completely cut off from their families, where other people can move to another island and stay temporarily with family members and friends. LGBTQI plus people have much fewer options in terms of housing. So everyone has the same basic needs. Yes, everyone needs food, but what about culturally relevant food? We were providing supplies to a particular shelter that was catering mostly to Haitian people. So we went there and said, what else do you need? What are some things that would be nice? Because we know that we're providing the food, the water, whatever, but are there some things that you would like to have? And they said, you know what, with the food, it would be great to have a Haitian breakfast. The simplest thing, right? But we're just giving them eggs and like American breakfast, Bahamian breakfast, but what they'd really like to have is the food that they would eat at home. So thinking about all of these things as we start to respond to the specific needs of people, we have to look at their identities, we have to look at their lived experiences, and we have to start with them. So one of the things that Equality Bahamas is doing right now is focusing on policy. And we're doing feminist policy making sure that we're starting with the people who we serve. So we don't want to sit around a table with 4 or 5 of us or in a group like this and make decisions for people. We're bringing them in. We're talking to people who we know we assisted during the storm and asking them, what were your needs? What were the things that didn't work for you? What were the things that made it difficult for you to get what you actually needed? What went wrong, and how can we correct that? So we're holding innovation labs, teaching them the innovation process. So they're able to learn that and take that with them throughout their lives, but we also end up with policies. We end up with recommendations for legislation, for programming that actually responds to the real needs of these people based on their lived experience, and recognizing them as experts in their own experience, and understanding ourselves not to be experts or people who are meant to hold power, but people who are meant to share that power, and empowering other people to be able to take the lead in these processes to ensure that when this happens again, because we know it's when, it's not if, we are responding in a more holistic and a more sustainable way.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I think that was an excellent example of how not just we talk about bringing people in or consulting doing consultations with local populations, et cetera, about how do you actually implement something. And that's, I think, a good example for all of us, is to take something, take people's lived experiences and see how we can get better, right? And how we can all take that forward, not just in disasters, but also in slow onset cases or otherwise. And I think you also raised the important point of, you know, in the beginning, right? Climate is not just climate, right? But it's also not just that a storm arrives or disaster arrives, it's what was happening before that, what got people to that place. And seeing, you know, we talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, but also climate change is, again, a vulnerability multiplier. Migration is not a threat, right? It's the vulnerability that is the threat. And that's where we need to perhaps think and reorient ourselves a little bit in how we discuss this threat approach. So last but certainly not least, coming from the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, Lavitinalagi, how do you see this from either a climate justice perspective or a youth perspective manifesting in the Pacific?
Thank you so much. I hope I do justice. I'm a bit overwhelmed sitting here this morning. I guess I would like to provide a bit of context about the Pacific. Most of the Pacific Island countries were colonized, and there are still countries that are still under colonial powers. And historically, in the Pacific, it was a very diverse communities that we had. We had people of diverse sexual orientation in our own language. We have, you know, the Fa'afafine, the Fa'afatama, the Wakasaleolewa, and, you know, these are people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identities. And so when we had these colonial powers coming in, you know, they came with their, you know, their own laws, colonial laws, and so, you know, there was a sodomy law, and so they wiped away, you know, most of these third gender identities. And so ever since then, you know, we are predominantly Christian societies, very patriarchal, and so the current situation is that most of these often marginalized groups and already vulnerable, you know, during climate-induced disasters are further pushed to the peripheries. And so we don't have a lot of research and studies that are being done specifically in the Pacific. There's relatively new research that are coming out. But there was one in 2016, the Down by the River research, which was carried out in Fiji. And so it looked specifically at the impacts of disasters on sexual and gender minority groups. And already, similarly to, you know, the experiences my other panelists have shared, they already have, you know, deep systematic levels of stigma and discrimination and ostracization from state and also from, you know, the communities around them. And then when a disaster happens, it further exacerbates that for many of these marginalized groups. One good example was when this, you know, the strongest tropical cyclone to make a landfall in the southern hemisphere, Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016, many of the LGBTQI community chose not to go to evacuation centers for fear of safety and protection. They felt safer in the homes that were tearing apart in the height of cyclone because of safety. And most of these evacuation centers were churches and schools. And then there comes, you know, sexual and gender-based violence during and, you know, and after the aftermath of the disasters. They were unable to access both government, you know, humanitarian response because they were singled out. They didn't fit into, you know, what society saw as family. And so there was a lot of issues. We came to also hear, you know, there were times when LGBTQI individuals would go to government services, and in front of many other people who were there to access services, they were made to, you know, they were asked, what are you? So they were made to self-question their identity in front of many, and it's not really a kind of experience one would like to experience. And those were some of the deterrents that kept them away from accessing services. And those were, some of the challenges. And so there were also those who were dropping out of school, young people, as a result of disasters, and weren't able to go back to school. And so now they're working in the informal sectors. They're working in, sex work industry, and it's every day they're stigmatized. They're harassed. They're verbally abused, and it has an impact on their bodies. And they're unable to access psychosocial support and counseling because most of the service providers, tend to discriminate them at these service providers. And so those were some of the experiences specifically with LGBTQI. With young people and indigenous young people, now as we are experiencing an era of loss and damage, we are already seeing that we are losing our traditional and indigenous knowledge and wisdom. And so one of the work that we're trying to do is to revive that, and also draw on that in terms of the kind of solutions to deal with the climate emergency. And so we are seeing, mass internal displacement from rural to urban communities, and it's putting pressure on most, in many of these urban communities. And so we are seeing social issues such as unemployment, high crime rates in these particular, and they become like red zones. And that's because people are forced to move from their communities. They're unable to build their livelihood, and they're seeking better opportunities in cities. And at the same time, they're putting pressure on even the city councils in terms of waste and sanitation management and roads and electricity. So these are some of the things that we are seeing firsthand in some of the communities across Fiji. The other thing I wanted to share was one of the work now that we are doing is we're trying to work closely with faith-based organizations, specifically because they wield such a power on our communities. And we realize that most of the harmful narratives and harmful accusations, I would say, against LGBTQI are emanating from, it has religious narratives. So, for instance, LGBTQI people are blamed for being the cause of the disaster. They're saying, it's similar to Sodom and Gomorrah. Your sinful ways has led us to this path where, we are going to experience more and more disasters. And so we are working with faith communities to building on some of the value systems, not so much of human rights, because if you say human rights, it's a sort of a pushback from local communities. So we're using the traditional values of respect, of inclusion, of care for one another, and we're using that to approach communities and community leaders and say, these are your flesh and blood, these are your own people that you're pushing out. And that's a work that's in progress. It's a very, a very sensitive topic back in Fiji, and every now and then when, especially with elections, and politicians like to use this LGBTQI agenda as a sort of a topic to draw voters. And in particular, I'll give an example. So just days before election, in like Fiji, there's sort of like a blackout. You can't do any more campaign and stuff. But there was a fake news that circulated that a certain party was going to support LGBTQI. And that sort of moved voters to the other party. And so so LGBTQI people have sort of become, part of the, politicians, way, sort of not a joke, but a way to canvass votes. and it further harms the community. And so one of the work that we're doing with the faith leaders is to try to address those, the kind of messaging that are going out to the community. Should be around inclusion, should be around care and love for one another. And yeah, it's a very difficult and sensitive topic, but we're getting there. And in terms of policy and practice and program, there's a gap. This, it's incoherent. Fiji has one of the most progressive constitution when it comes to LGBTQI rights. We have a specific section that protects people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. However, when you look at what's the practice on the ground, it's totally a different reality. And so we're trying to bridge that, the gap between policy and also program and practice. Our colleagues have mentioned, disaggregated data. We're working with humanitarian actors, giving them training, sensitizing them, providing them with the tools and the toolkits to be able to collect this data, to inform any intervention during and after disasters, any climate responses, etc. So that's an ongoing work as well, and it's I think we're soon going to get to a place where I'm hopeful and optimism that people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities are protected. So that's all that I can share, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think that was also another. Each of you gave a completely different perspective, and yet all in the same stream. I think that was all giving very rich perspectives. And I like also talking about an example where you're seeing multiple sides of intersectionality, maybe sometimes being at odds, and where religious, faith-based organizations maybe are the ones who are having a negative impact or adverse feelings towards another marginalized group, and how that plays out. And I think, again, another wonderful example concretely of actions that can be taken and that we can learn from within regional contexts, right?
Sorry, can I just add one thing? I lost this, but just remembered. So one of the things we're doing is we're developing a set of policies, and what we're doing is we're letting the groups themselves lead the policy process. So in terms of LGBTQI policy and climate change, we're getting LGBTQI people to lead that process. They are the ones that are going to do the consultation. They're the ones that are going to get the feedback and the put together analysis, etc. And similarly for youth. And now we are working on disability inclusion. And we are already in conversation with disability groups to get them for them to do nationwide consultations process. And I think that's what applied intersectionality means. You're letting the group themselves lead the process about what's going to, what affects them. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that really helpful addition. And I want to invite each of you, because you've mentioned a lot of examples that I think everyone would like to know more about, to share these either with the organizers, and we'll be happy to publicize them, promote them, circulate them, and continue a dialogue about these, and we can learn more about these initiatives after this event. I know myself, I'm personally very intrigued to hear all of these and continue these conversations as a member of the non-economic losses expert group. So we're also taking this forward in terms of human mobility guidelines. How can we look at human mobility and build those guides with all of this information that we have? But now I want to open this conversation up to the audience. What I'm going to do is invite you to step to one of the mics we have on each side of the room according to COVID-safe regulations. And when you have a question, as I know you do, you can move to the mic. And I just ask you to introduce yourself to us before you ask your question to either one panelist or all of the panelists. I know we'll also be taking questions from the virtual audience, so please, if you're watching virtually, do not feel that you don't have a voice here. We would love to hear from you as well. So please.
Hi, my name is Maya. I'm a student from Duke University. I wanted to ask particularly about queer environmentalism, sexual orientation, gender diversity. I've looked at the UNFCCC's woman and gender constituency. And I feel that queerness isn't as reflected, at least from this overview of the constituency. So I was wondering if you had any input on how to properly incorporate that within the whole group, and how that could be an opportunity for coalition building and, intersectionality, because by having this, understanding of queer environmentalism, we can bring in more BIPOC communities, queer communities of color. And then I also wanted to ask the final panelist about, how do you, I feel like working with faith-based organizations, that sounds super difficult. I'm a queer Muslim myself, and it can be difficult. So I want to know how, what are specific ways that you're able to bridge that gap? Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. So why don't we start with Levitanagi? You can answer first, and then we'll open up for the second question, or if you want to comment on her first question as well.
Thank you. If I heard you correct, you were asking about how did we breach the gap between working with faith? And so when we started the work, what we had to do was we had to map out, who were in the space, and then we had to find allies within the faith community, within the faith leadership community, to do this work, to co-lead this work with us. And we were thankful that we have some really progressive leaders within, the churches in Fiji. So very few of them. And through that entry point, we were able to schedule a meeting. So they usually have this peak body meeting, the Fiji Council of Churches. That's where the church leaders are represented, and it was a very I guess frightening and overwhelming moment to move into that room where you have church leaders. You have the head of the Catholic Church, the head of the Anglican, the head of Methodist Church. They're all sitting in the rooms, and they hold PhDs in theology, and they could rebut your point in many different points, but I guess they were very, the approach that we use in the Pacific is totally different because it's, through a Talanoa approach. It's a very inclusive dialogue of respect. And so through that process, we were able to say, these are the issues that these particular marginalized groups are experiencing, and you as leaders have a responsibility to look into this issue because we are losing life every year. And you can't just stand there at the pulpit and turn your back toward this particular group. And so that sort of, got them to start the dialogue. So it was a series of dialogue that we have to have first. But even as those dialogues were happening, and we were putting, the framing was people of diverse OGS in the humanitarian, during disasters. And we know in the Pacific, we are now experiencing more intense and frequent disasters because of the warming ocean. And the ocean is actually what gives the energy to tropical cyclones. So what we're saying is, as we are going to experience more of these cyclones, we're going to see many, many more community members being driven out of their own homes, out in the streets, and churches has to do something about that, and I think that's what prompted them to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would anyone?
If I may,
please.
The 80% of the world is of faith. So we can't have a one-shoe-fits-all kind of an approach when it comes to how do we move forward with engaging faith leaders. And it can be from any faith. One of the crux or the basics of engaging faith leaders is how do you connect the issue with the teachings and what has been translated from the scriptures, which is actually implementable or understandable with regards to certain challenges that we're faced with on the ground. And this requires concerted efforts, even individual meetings, to make sure that I, as an individual, have a full grip or command of the understanding from different people on that specific subject. And that is when I'm going to be a good advocate when it comes to talking about the issue. If we don't understand it, if we are unable to explain to the audience, to the faith leaders, in terms of what the issue is and how we see their role making a difference, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just going to be crosstalk or a meeting where we just discuss the issue but do not arrive at a conclusion. Climate change is actually furthering or exacerbating the challenges that the people are facing. And there are multiple segments within each society. And when I said inclusion, I meant all these segments. You cannot just specifically identify one and leave the other. So you need to have all these segments incorporated into it. So I'll talk about Pakistan. There's been loads and loads of areas which are facing the brunt of climate change in Pakistan. And I usually use a statement that out of the 249 countries, the impacts of climate change on 248 countries collected or culminated together is being experienced by Pakistan because of its topography, starting from the north, the glacial melting, to the south when the sea is entering the agricultural land. We have lost land to sea. There have been displacements from those areas. And we have Sikhs, we have Hindus, we have Muslims, we have Christians who have been displaced. So all these four displaced, but when you bifurcate within each society, there's going to be certain segments who are going to be at an extreme verge of being affected the most. And when we start talk about their issues, their challenges, the issue or the roadblock that we'll be faced with is with certain segments who are in power of making certain things change are not actually in favor of talking about those people or talking about those issues that are impacting on those people. So coming back to the point, we need to actually understand what the faith says and how it's connected with the current challenges on the ground, and what's the connection between that to be able to actually give out a stronger message in terms of creating a coalition or creating a like-minded set of people or a group. So that's about it.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists like to comment on Maya's questions?
Yeah, on the first question, I think what you've said, what you've asked is really the first step, right? When we see that there's that absence and we're in that space, we have to call it out. We have to say the names of the people who aren't in the room and amplify their messages. And sometimes that just means, pulling out your phone and seeing who's tweeting what and getting up to the mic and reading a tweet and saying, this is what queer people are saying. Why are no queer people in this space? This is one of the most inaccessible COPs, I think. Everyone's been talking about it. And I've noticed in a lot of the events that I've attended that there's this sort of segmentation. So you would see women on panels that are about mainstreaming gender, and you would see youth on panels about young people, but other panels don't seem to have that representation. Other panels don't always have a young person, don't always have a queer person, don't always have a migrant person to talk about their experiences, to talk about the work that they're doing. And we have to make sure that we change that. And that might start with actually having a visualization of who the people are who are living in situations of vulnerability, the same way that we have these sort of geographic maps where we can see which islands, which countries are really being affected by climate change. Perhaps we need a stakeholder map where we see the different groups of people that are being disproportionately affected by climate change, who are already in situations of vulnerability and being even more marginalized by the effects of climate change, as well as the measures that are being taken to respond to climate change. Because that's really what justice is, right? It's shifting that power, it's saying their names, it's looking in a room and saying who is not here, Why are they not here? How can I bring their message here? And how can I make sure that the next time we're in a room like this, those people are present? So I think asking those questions is really important. Having these conversations is important, but we have to make sure that we take action on it once we leave the room, and that question doesn't just stay in that room, but it hangs around and pushes us forward to be better, to do better, and to require more of the people who we're looking to for the recommendations and the solutions.
Thank you so much. Our next question, could you introduce yourself and then your question, please?
Hi, my name is Tyler. I'm a student at Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia in America. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you all so much for being here. One particular question I had, a lot of the work that you all seem to do in your own countries and in your own sectors seems to be very radical and seems to, especially I think as the gentleman from Fiji was saying, has this kind of anti-colonial framework to it. How do you feel like you translate the work that you're doing in your own organizations to kind of like this national conversation that really brings forwards, as I think you were saying in the Bahamas, bringing forwards policy points that can actually help to be more prefigurative so these outcomes don't happen? And then secondly, how do you legitimize the epistemologies or like the actual experiences and the ways of knowing of the people that you work with to also meet that kind of policy that would really kind of create the kinds of frameworks and systems that would offer the kind of political changes that are also necessary. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Would anyone like to jump in on that?
It's about people power. Like I was saying, one of the things that we do, we make sure that we're not just in small rooms with each other, talking about what we think would be a great idea and what we think would help people, but actually reaching those communities. So, in a much broader way, we are working toward a certain number of legal reforms. We're looking at policies and recognizing that the political will isn't there, and so we have to be able to build that. And to get our politicians to make certain positions, we need to be able to show them that the people on the ground support those positions. We need to build a larger constituency and mobilize those people to push politicians to take particular actions. And that means that we have to be in community with people. That means that we can't just be an advocacy organization. We can't just be policymakers. We can't just be looking at legal reform. We have to be talking to people, listening to them, and involving them in the process. And it's a pretty unpopular thing to do. It's a pretty slow process. I mean, we're going through it right now with a couple of things. One of the things that we're doing is developing a set of feminist standards for governance, because we just elected a new administration. And what happens is the political parties come and they give you sort of their agenda and they try to sell you on the agenda. And we thought, forget that. We have our own agenda. We're going to develop it with the people. And it's slow going because people aren't used to being engaged in that way. People are sort of used to saying, this is wrong, that's wrong, we need this, but not really walking through the problem and mapping it out and figuring out how we solve the problem. So it's a process of engaging people and realizing that it will be slow, it will be hard to get people involved, but as you start to develop those recommendations and start to go on radio shows to talk about them, and you share them on Facebook and have somebody do TikTok and all that kind of stuff, people start to get interested, even if they're only interested to show you the gaps. Because that's what happens, right? People say, this isn't good enough, y'all didn't talk about this, this, and this. That's a great opportunity to say, you know what? Thank you for pointing that out. Would you like to come to our next session? Because what you've just said is really important. So being able to take on that criticism, being able to make it constructive even when it isn't, and continuing to engage people no matter what, and understanding that we're making a cultural shift here. And that's more important than having these quick fixes. We need to be able to engage people and get them accustomed to being a part of the process.
Thank you.
As an advocate or people who do advocacy, I believe in getting your feet dirty on the ground first. And getting your feet dirty on the ground does not mean you go out into the field and come back and start talking about them. It's a process where you start to engage the communities. I'll give you an example. Climate change, we all say it is happening. Some people say it might happen, but there's a huge segment which says it is bound to happen because it's going to lead to the last day, the doomsday, end of the earth. And why are you even talking about it? It's said to happen. So what? Are you trying to interfere in the ways of the God or what he has planned for you. Now, that's a mindset that you come across when you enter the communities, when you talk to people who are actually suffering. But we are used to converting sufferings into a process that has been laid out. And that's a very pretty or easy way out for us not to do anything to correct the mistakes that we are making. And this requires stepwise approach where you talk to different segments within the society. You talk to them about the issues. You talk to them about their behaviors. You talk to them about stepping up. You talk to them about being able to explain or articulate the challenges that they're faced with. When it comes to COP, and I second her, how many people from the developing countries or the countries being impacted or the people being impacted are here to raise their voice? We are the privileged few that are here to talk about this. And hearing the impacts from the people that have actually gone through it makes a huge difference. And that's the thing which we don't understand. Because we are very good, I'm sorry for using this word, but we are very good drawing room advocates. Rather, we don't want to step out into the field, and we want to build on the knowledge or the words or the information given to us from the people in the provinces or in the districts or in the states or at the national level who actually haven't been out into the field, and then making policies up at this level. And if we make policies based on what the process I explained, those policies are not going to work. You need to have a people-centered approach in terms of policy making, legislation, as well as promoting these actions at the grassroots level so that people can change themselves. There's a saying, or there's a hadith in the Quran which says that if you're doing ablution or wuzu prior to praying, and if you are at the bank of a river, do not waste water. What does it say? It says you're not supposed to waste anything, even if it's in abundance. And what are we doing in our communities? We are polluting things, we are wasting things, we are misusing the resources without even thinking that this would have an impact on the future. And then yet leave everything to be destined as it is written and it will happen, and not challenging our own actions and behaviors. But there are certain people who have to tell them that your behaviors and actions are not wise, not contributing, not leading to a course which is going to be a sustainable one. And that requires courage. And I think we need to actually invest our time by engaging communities at the very grassroots level, by changing their behaviors and mindsets and bringing out the words or through the sufferings that they've seen up at this level to be able to make a difference.
Can I?
Sorry?
Yeah. Can I just add on to that? I think my fellow panelists have covered most of what I can also share, but there was one thing I wanted to point out was the work to, to shift the power and shift the narratives to local communities is about also reclaiming our language. And that's something we're doing in Fiji because, we came through a colonial period. And if you go to our schools, if someone is speaking in Itauke, which is the native language, you're sort of shunned. And, it's good to be seen to speak, you need to speak English rather than your native language. So we're trying to reclaim language, our own language, because that's, language to us is what basically is how we move and navigate into the world and also what holds power. But in the context of the work around SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, we don't, even with LGBT, that's, the people in the Pacific, they're saying, we don't see ourselves as LGBT, we are not gay, we are not lesbian. We are Fa'afafine, we are Vakasaleolewa, that's our identity. We don't conform to this rigid box, and you put us and say, oh, you are transgender. They don't see themselves as transgenders. So the work is also finding language to convey some of, these complex terms like sexual orientation and gender identity. So as we are speaking to communities, we also need to ensure that the terms that we are using is context appropriate, it's relevant, it's something that they can understand. If we keep on coming back and say sexual orientation, gender identity, that's something they're not familiar with. And I think that's the whole work around, shifting power and also reclaiming our own identities is through language. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see we have a couple more questions. I'm just going to ask you to be brief with your questions so that we can try to get through as many as we can in the short amount of time we have left. So we'll start over here.
Really a pleasure to be here. The question is for the first panelist. You mentioned how migration is a form of climate change adaptation. And at this COP, one of the big pushes is to have 50% of funding go towards adaptation instead of mitigation. And I think a lot of that is about, pretty much mitigation you can make money off of that. Would you elaborate on how we can move so that people can recognize that, migration is a form of climate adaptation and potentially even find ways to have even funding routed towards facilitating climate migration?
Well, thank you. It's a difficult question from my perspective because I'm a researcher, so and I think that we're trying to figure it out in research how we demonstrate that actually migration can be a good adaptation strategy. But I think one way to move forward could be in national adaptations plan and maybe like to have a national and local governments to try and combine disaster risk management strategies and national adaptation plans, because migration is the both. It's about preventing displacement, so that's why it's important to be in the disaster risk management strategies, because it's about preventing displacement, and it's about including some policies and some programs that allow for people to move more easily, to relocate if they want to, but also to stay in place if they want to. So it's about, there's this huge spectrum of mobility outcomes, like what we call in research. So it's about allowing people to do what they want in a way. Like if they want to, if for example, in the Colombian example I mentioned before, some families, they could move out and that's what they wanted. They wanted to move out temporarily and come back. But the others, they were forced to move afterwards because they couldn't adapt the way they wanted to. So I think it's just about understanding that mobility outcomes are so many and it depends so much on the needs, but also on the aspirations of people. So that's also maybe something that we need to take into account, and that some of the policies that advocate for migration can actually lead to maladaptation, because people they don't want to move, or they don't have or where to move. So it's also about understanding that that's not the only viable solution, because it can lead to maladaptation. So I think that's how can we can try to move forward with that. I don't know.
Thank you, Tatiana. So I believe in order, we have here and then to the other side of the panel. Again, try to just keep it brief so we can get through those last questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm Shirin Lira from Bangladesh. We are working in a climate migration program. So my question is to our friend from Pakistan who was talking about climate migration. So I wanted to know, is there any good practices in Pakistan where you have succeeded on getting national finance or global finance to address climate migrants, or like to look at the opportunity for secondary cities for climate migrants. So it's just for my curiosity to know how Pakistan is looking into these issues, because it's kind of similar situation. The issues that you have mentioned for young children, women, and the risk of trafficking and other issues are similar for Bangladesh as well, as you know. So it will be good to know some good practices. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to take the last question?
You know what, that's a good idea. Let's take the last question, and then we'll wrap up after.
Hi, thanks. I'm Trish from Heidelberg University in Germany. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate intersectionality as an interesting academic concept, but I struggle a little bit more with how it's translated into practice and policy in a way that benefits people. So I wonder if you have an example of policy, migration policy related to intersectionality that leads to a better outcome than a policy that would perhaps not include intersectionality, and how that's different from a needs-based analysis or a needs-based policy. Thank you.
What a great question. Okay, so any of the panelists to either question?
Okay. One, we learn from Bangladesh, first thing first, because it's at the forefront of a lot of disasters, and migration has been happening in a huge manner. We've seen displacements happen. And at the same time, the new report that came out a few days ago presents a very alarming picture with regards to how the situation is going to evolve. And building on that, if you convert that picture for Pakistan, it's already happening there in different regions and different scenarios. What we've been trying to do is to make the governance structures flexible to be able to adopt the cross-section of thematic focuses into one policy. So if there's rapid onset disaster, we have national disaster management agencies to respond to it. But when it's slow onset disasters such as droughts because of changing precipitations, we don't have anything. We have every department working in isolation. So the meteorological department monitoring the precipitations, but not passing on to data to the agriculture department. And they are unable to pass on the data to the farmers to be able to readjust themselves. We've been working on integrated or multi-sectoral policies to be developed in Pakistan, taking into account all those departments that are working in those areas. We've been successful to a considerable extent, but the bureaucratic impediments are always there. The solo approach of each department is always a hurdle when it comes to mainstreaming all those departments' work into one. And this is one of the reasons why we fail in terms of producing any pilots, any models when it comes to actually showcasing something. The recent displacements due to 10 years long drought spell in Balochistan has led the Balochistan government to think on the points that we were advocating for the past 10 years. We were raising this point with regards to having an integrated plan to address drought. And we've been successful in terms of producing a drought framework for the government of Balochistan, which talks about the role of each and every department when it comes to addressing this issue. Right now, we are talking about drought policy for that specific province. How do you actually consider drought as an emergency and a one which is going to be more affecting than the rapid one? It is going to, I'll go back, almost 475,000 households, families, as you would say, got displaced within this 10 year from 3 regions in Balochistan. They lost approximately 1 million livestock. They lost approximately 20,000 acres of land and a lot of areas which were date farming. So all these farms were lost, and there was nothing that was being done to reclaim them. And then Islamic Relief, along with the government, came in and started different alternate models, which we had studied from different countries such as Germany, such as Sweden, such as Australia and others, with regards to producing a contextualized model on how do we reclaim this land. How do we actually sensitize these people to move back and start rebuilding again? And the second point with regards to actually having the intersectionality thing within the policy domain, I agree it's not very easy to implement those actions, but at the same time develop a policy on intersectionality covering everything into it as well. So it's a huge uphill battle when it comes to actually connecting the implementation and the policy making together, and it's a challenge. And having experience from different countries across the globe would allow us to actually think through it, if we are serious enough to think on those lines, to develop something which can be piloted in any one country or in any one region to start with, and then come out with something which is going to be serving as a pilot model for other countries. Although, as I said, one size does not fit all, so we'll need to contextualize all those pilots into different regions, but let's start with something somewhere across the globe and come out with a pilot.
Oh, what an excellent conclusion. You've done my wrap up for me perfectly and kept the time. Well, in closing this panel, I first want to thank our panelists again. Sincerely, this is one of the best side events I've been a part of in my years at the COP, and I think where I've learned a great deal. And I hope that going forward, we continue these conversations. As you said, building these coalitions across regions, learning from each other, from different groups, even if that's not about creating, one perfect policy, but about seeing how these policies can be implemented and start at least the conversation. And I also hope, which has been mentioned by our panelists, that we do kind of recognize that this room is unlike most rooms at COP. And I think it's important to recognize that, and as you said, speak out to that. And so I hope that going forward in the COP, you do look at the rooms and ask why there aren't voices being raised, and hopefully in future COPs, challenge that and reconfigure that so that we don't have to have panels just about intersectionality. So thank you again, and I wish you a pleasant day.
Thank you.